make your mind a rack. 1 week password can make the system black. I see that legacy box with the cracked up port. Vendor said leave it, that ain't support. Need to fix him fast, but I know the rule. One bad reboot can shut down the fuel, so I map it out. One node at a time, check the path twice. Keep the line alive. If I patch tonight, I can save tomorrow. Move too hard and the whole plan follow. Patch it clean, keep it online. Virtual patch, don't take it.
Welcome to the webinar. My name's Leon Poggioli, founder of NetSeg.io, and it's great to have you for the next video talking about exposure and vulnerability management for cyber physical systems. So let's get into it. I'll start by talking a little bit about NetSeg with a quick recap. I'll talk about the vulnerability versus exposure mindset and a better way to think about cyber risk in OT. And it's not just CVE scores. I think a lot of us have moved beyond just looking at that lens, other ways to prioritize, and prioritization is really key in OT, where the effort required to remediate a particular vulnerability tends to be a lot higher than in the IT world. I'll talk through very high level best practices around building an exposure remediation playbook in partnership with those OT asset owners, and then some use cases in a live system. As always, I'll be using Clarity, but the other tools do very similar things. I'm just using it to illustrate how it would work in that kind of tool and how to build your workflows and interact with the, or share that data with the different stakeholders in the OT environment. So NetSeg was founded this year by me. My name is Leon Poggioli. I used to be Australia New Zealand Regional Vice President for Clarity. And I really started the business because I wanted to go beyond technology and wanted to solve those people process challenges that I saw were a big constraint in driving effective OT cybersecurity. So if you are trying to do something around OT cybersecurity in your organization, you don't know where to start, or you don't have an OT cyber specialist even on a fractional basis to help you, that's really where I can help you build the right program, build the right prioritization, build the relationships with those OT asset owners that are critical to driving an effective program practically. And I'm all about doing practical things that give you really fast returns and good return on investment, driving an effective program that's right-sized for your organization. So first video was around asset integrity. Check it out, it's on the channel. And really the core message is you can't protect what you don't know about. And that's why asset integrity comes first. You can't address vulnerabilities if you don't know what's actually in your network. And with a vulnerability and exposure lens, you really need those stakeholder engagement for the OT counterparts, because you're probably going to need their help to remediate these vulnerabilities. And it's really not a good idea to throw a list of 1,000 vulnerabilities over the fence and say, oh, it's your problem now. That's not going to get you anywhere. So it is going to get a bigger and bigger problem because, as I mentioned in the first video, there's a mega trend driving the demand for CPS or OT cybersecurity. More and more technology is going into these environments, and that's creating a new cyber risk attack surface that we need to address. It's a new risk that's emerging that wasn't as pronounced a risk before. Basically, more automation, more connectivity, more technology. And so fixing vulnerabilities and exposures is very different in the OT world versus the IT world. You need to wait for patching windows. You need to maybe come up with alternate remediations that don't involve patching, at least in the short term. And you need to bring those OT stakeholders on every step of the journey, because it's basically impossible if you have a hostile relationship with your OT counterparts. But there are some really effective ways to build a really good working relationship where they actually understand what you're trying to achieve, how it's going to impact their operational priorities, so that all of a sudden they want to help you drive the effective program and turn them into allies. And that is really the ultimate goal. Everything becomes 10 times easier when you've got the OT counterparts on board, understanding what you're trying to achieve and wanting to help you make it happen. It can work, believe me, trust me, I can make it work. I've seen it work. So vulnerabilities versus exposures, and the reason I've got this slide is, especially when I was at Clarity, I'd often talk to people going, we need a tool like this to do our OT vulnerability program. We've got all these CVEs, we don't know about them, how do we address them and find them and things like that. I think there's more to fixing those inherent risks than just focusing on vulnerabilities, because there are other kinds of exposures that exist in an environment, like devices that have end of life, devices that, you know, are sitting on flat networks, need to be segmented better, unsanctioned external connectivity. Like, for a lot of organizations, that hidden 3G modem in the cupboard that a contractor put in there that no one knows about, you're probably much better off trying to find that versus finding a CVE that's buried down in like level 2 Purdue that's never going to be reachable from the outside world. Or, you know, if you can address that 3G modem, then it becomes unreachable. Now, the other thing to consider is you can't just bulk push patches because there's a lot of operational realities to updating systems. And so fixing the risks tends to take longer and be harder and require more manual intervention. So it's better to look at exposures overall that impact cyber risk and prioritize them holistically versus just thinking tunnel vision, what are my vulnerabilities, starting with the CVE 10s and working your way down. There's much better ways to do that now. And it allows you to have a much more practical conversation with those OT stakeholders where you can go, historically, I have heard of situations where people have just gone, oh yeah, I've got like 1,000 vulnerabilities. I've given it to the OT team. It's their problem now. They think I'm an idiot. They told me to get stuffed. They're just no help at all. Well, if someone throws you a whole bunch of work with no guidance on how to fix it or where to start, well, you're probably not going to want to work with them. But if you take that list of 1,000 vulnerabilities and go, look, there are 1,000 vulnerabilities in your organization, but we're not asking you to fix 1,000. We found the 5 that are going to give you the best risk reduction. They're on the most critical devices. And here's some guidance on how to remediate them. We're happy to work with you to help do that. And here's the operational impact if they get exploited. All of a sudden, you've had a much more productive conversation. You've framed it in operational reality, and you've made it a much more manageable list of things to get done where you can maybe access a 2-hour maintenance window in the next month to get those fixed. And all of a sudden, you're starting to build positive momentum with these stakeholders around, yeah, let's address these risks because it's going to help us keep the plant running and reduce our risk of cyber attack. So that, in my view, is a better way to think about it. And here's some data points. You know, I got this a couple of weeks ago just from pulling the NVD. You know, nearly 200,000 CVEs, but only 1,600 of those are known exploited vulnerabilities. And so some questions to ask when you're, so effectively we're reducing nearly 20x. We're reducing, or 15 times, reducing the total number of CVEs to KEBs, right? So just by focusing on CVEs that have known exploits, you've reduced the work to a 15th. Other questions you can then ask is the device even reachable? How could someone reach it to exploit the vulnerability? How critical is the device's function? Because we want to put that criticality lens to make sure we're focused on things that could actually stop the plant versus things that maybe aren't so critical, like the office coffee machine, although I would argue that an office coffee machine is very critical to operations. But that's just how things work in my house. And what are our remediation options? Demanding a patching window for a CVE10 that's never been exploited and is not reachable in the environment is probably not building a good long-term working relationship versus being able to say, we've identified this critical vulnerability. We've been able to do some additional network hardening so it can't be exploited from the outside world. Now let's find a patching window in the next few months where we can do that patch, and maybe we test it in the lab first because it's a critical device. Much more productive conversation, and a little bit of upfront work and context helps save you a lot of hassle long-term and frustration when you are not fully understanding the operational constraints to delivering this program, to building a good working relationship with those OT counterparts in your organization. So another really helpful way I find to frame exposure management, particularly in OT, is the Gartner CTEM, Continuous Threat and Exposure Management methodology. I think this was originally designed for OT environments, but IT environments, but I think it's equally important in OT environments because it takes you through this cycle of 5 steps around scoping the risk, discovering what's happening, prioritization, very key in OT, validation, which is where you're actually working with those stakeholders to validate, yes, these are critical devices and we can see how this vulnerability could get exploited, what the operational impact could be, which then forces a justification or justifies the effort required to mobilize and address that vulnerability. And because you've got the data, you can have a very productive conversation where you're not holding them to ransom around, I'm going to hold a gun to your head to try, you've got to patch this device, not effective, versus saying, here's what we can do now that reduces the risk by 20%, and here's what we can do in 3 weeks' time that reduces the risk by 95%, for example. So I think that's a very helpful way. And, part of the reason I started NetSeg was technology can't do this. You need to do this with those OT stakeholders and work together. So if you're worried about AI taking your tech job, learn to do this because this is the future. So let's talk about going beyond vulnerabilities and into exposures. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but things like device end of life, unsanctioned external connectivity. If you've got an OEM that's maybe maintaining some devices in your network, if they've got a persistent VPN, what happens if their organization gets compromised? All of a sudden, you've got an open channel back into your plant. Now, there are other ways to address this. If there aren't other ways, you can segment those devices from the rest of the network so that the blast radius is decreased. These are ways you can progressively reduce risk in practical ways versus trying to just make yourself unhackable, which we all know is not realistic. Vendors of concern. This is a newish terminology that's come out of the Department of Home Affairs in Australia, where certain sovereign risks have been identified where vendors from those certain countries, not naming any names, from those countries might be a risk. So being aware of those sorts of things like CCTV cameras, for example, default passwords and expired certificates. And then another one is lack of network zoning and segmentation. And I'm going to do a video on network segmentation because it seems like a very intimidating project to go, okay, we're going to have to put firewalls in the environment or build this really complicated set of access control lists on our routers. I'm going to address all of that and ways that you can alert on zone policy deviation and be able to do network segmentation visibility at least without having to go through all that and getting really fast results. But separate topic. So we're going to go back to the NetSeg methodology of OTCSJ. So vulnerability exposure management really sits between stage 3 and stage 4 because one of the first things you're probably going to get that's useful, low-hanging fruit, things you can address when you do the initial discovery and assessment in stage 3 is, we've got some vulnerabilities we now need to address. And so somewhere between stage 3 and stage 4, you're going to kick off a vulnerability exposure remediation program. And that program probably starts with just understanding what are those risks and then in what order should I prioritize those risks. And it's going to be a mix of likelihood and impact. So you're going to need to understand device criticality. You're going to need to work with those device owners to understand the criticality of the different devices in their environment. So that's why you need to work with these stakeholders to get a good outcome. The other thing you need is exposure and vulnerability management remediation playbooks, right? And you need to co-create these with the OT teams. So very similar to threat detection incident response playbooks, you need to build a vulnerability remediation playbook. So, it doesn't need to be super complicated. In fact, simpler is better, but a basic process to triage and prioritize. And I think Gartner CTEM is a good general guideline to help you build the framework. And I'm going to build some templates that people will be able to buy soon. But recognizing the operational constraints to just doing blanket patching, which is not realistic in most OT environments, and allows you to do a targeted approach in partnership with those OT asset owners. So at a high level, it is identification, triage and prioritization, remediation planning and approval, because there may be some level of change control involved here, and then implementation, verification and closure, right? And then, that's a very high level, and then you can basically take a draft template to the OT asset owners and work with them. You maybe socialize it with them first, get their agreement, or invite some input to based on what they think is going to work, and then find a few key exposures to work with initially, that you can work together to resolve, stress test the plan, and then update the plan accordingly. Now, I've seen people who have decided that, they have SLAs for patching in IT and they put the same SLAs in OT. That again is not realistic, right? If you've got a 48-hour patching window for critical vulnerabilities in the IT world, it just isn't going to happen. And I think it's unhelpful to dictate those kind of policies in the OT world, because it just signals to the OT asset owners that you don't understand their operational constraints they're working within. So I think it's important to be realistic about what SLAs you can patch and what other remediations might exist. And then when you really do need to patch something, like right now, when you have a trusted relationship with the OT asset owners, you can really hit that button and say, yeah, I know we're not supposed to do this, but here's the evidence. Here's why we need to patch this. Someone else just got popped. And then you can address it. And that is effective working relationship. Again, any technology can give you this, but you need the right working relationship with the OT asset owners to be able to actually get these business outcomes. So we're going to jump into the demo now. As I mentioned, I'm using Clarity, because not necessarily because I used to work for there, but because I'm very comfortable with the product and I'm a Clarity partner. I'm also partnered with other technology vendors in this space. So I'm going to start with a risk dashboard just to give you a feel for the most critical risks. I'm going to show you vulnerability filters and sort of get you down to some vulnerabilities. I'll show you how you can do bulk labeling and user assignment around remediation, and then how you report risks side by side, and some ways to try and drive some good behavior from your counterparts at the sites. So we're going to have to log back into the Clarity portal. My login expired while I was doing the presentation. Talk amongst yourselves while I'm waiting for the portal to load. And here we are at the Clarity dashboard. You're probably very familiar with this. Again, this is just demo data, but helps to illustrate. And I would say as well, if you've got the right engagement with an OT stakeholder, they'll want access to this portal, and you can just use RBAC, give them access to their data, get them interested, show them the information, and they're going to find it useful just for an operational perspective of the asset information. When you find a key vulnerability, they're going to be interested and engaged, and they're going to want to look for the vulnerabilities and address them. And that's really what you want, is have them working for you, because your job is just to, give them the information to protect the organization from cyber attacks. So let's jump to risks and exposures. So we'll just go risk overview first of all, and you can see here, like this risk score, one number, like that's a great thing you might show on a quarterly board pack, for example. But then you can do likelihood and impact heat map to very quickly zero down on the critical risk devices and critical vulnerabilities, right? And then you can see of the 4,000 total devices, you can drill on the 10% that are the most critical, and then start to prioritize by that. You might even go by site name, and our friend Jenny from the Bronx, let's look at the most critical. She's only got 3 critical devices you need to worry about. This is a great starting point to, ring up Jenny from the block and say, hey Jenny, this is where you might want to start as a starting point, and give her that view. But let's go back to vulnerabilities, and we want the vulnerabilities overview, because we want to do some vulnerability filters right now. It's very easy to filter on CVE 10, but we're not going to do that, because there's more to life than a CVE score. We want to look at CVSS score of just medium. So if you're just focused on CVSS score, you're probably never going to get to the mediums. You'll be lucky to hit all the criticals, with the speed that they're coming at. But let's get adjusted vulnerability score that is critical. So we're going beyond just CVSS score and looking at the most critical vulnerabilities. And here we've got 4 medium vulnerabilities that hit 996 vulnerable devices that are a medium CVSS score but a critical adjusted vulnerability score. And so let's look at all those vulnerable devices. And we can see here that Clarity, other products do this as well, but the priority groups have been set, and there are, I think, let's have a quick look. How many? Priority group 1. There's about 10 to 12 priority group 1 critical vulnerabilities. And you can see here that a lot of laptops, they should be easier to patch. And we could probably address those with patching. And then we go down, we've got these ABB engineering station. So that's probably where we'd want to start to actually, these would hopefully be fairly routine patches. And again, you work with the stakeholders on those. But let's look at these engineering workstations. We can see these 7 devices here from ABB. And let's just click on one here and find out a bit more about it. So it's on Houston line 1. And we got these labels here. Now this was discovered using both passive collection and edge scan. And if we go down here, we can actually look at a risk simulator of the different ways we can address this particular exposure. So you can see a total risk score here of 61.4, and so if we were to patch all the known vulnerabilities, and let's say we can do that, it's a Windows 10 device, well, we can get that risk score down to 56. That's great. If we implement all the recommendations, then we drop the risk score down to 40. So that's a much more helpful situation. So we basically dropped the likelihood down to a 23 versus if we reset the values, we're up here at 42. Now, patching may not be realistic for this particular device. So what if we do a better form of network segmentation, maybe optimize the ACL policy, or if we've got firewalls in place, putting some good firewall zone policies here, then all of a sudden we've dropped that risk score down to 40 because we've got these compensating controls that have offset a lot of the likelihood. So as you can see, you don't need to demand a patching window or wait for a patching window to be able to show how you can reduce the risk across the organization, right? And really, once you get comfortable with looking at vulnerabilities, you can start to look across the organization and look at, well, okay, let's look at what's been actively exploited, right? And then we might want to look at, these devices here. And we've got 404. Let's look at just the OT devices in the organization, right? And we can see all the OT devices here. Let's look at the ones we want to give to Jenny, right, in the Bronx. And again, it's 3 devices, but these are the 3 she needs to focus on, right? And that really makes it a lot more manageable and a lot more comfortable conversation. And it's probably this Vaisala BMS system that's the most critical, Windows Server 2016, right? So, but we might want to go, right, these 3 vulnerabilities here, let's now assign them to Jenny. Now this is a demo system, so I doubt there's a Jenny in the system, but let's give it a Jose instead, right? And then Jose's been assigned those vulnerabilities to research and look at how you remediate them. And so this particular device, what are the remediations? So you got exposed device so it's exposed and it's got KEV vulnerabilities, right? And these are the vulnerabilities we're aware of. And if we look at the risk simulator for this particular device, Windows Server 2016. So, we're probably going to want to patch all those known vulnerabilities so that there's no known vulnerabilities, and bang, that brings the likelihood right down. And if we put all the recommended controls in, well, we're significantly reducing the risk of that device. So it gives you a very quick way to prioritize what was, I think, let's look at how many vulnerabilities there were originally. 734 devices, 734 vulnerabilities and nearly 4,000 vulnerable devices. And drilling that down to 3 for one site asset owner makes it more manageable, and then you do another 3 in the next week, and then you can progressively reduce the risk in a really targeted way, so you're reducing the risk in the most effective manner. Now, one last thing I want to show you, and this is something I recommend for organizations. If you're running cyber in your organization, you want to drive maybe some friendly competition across those sites, you can stack rank sites based on their maturity. And so what you might want to do is let's look at total risk by site. And you might want to nestle this in with the other reports, but if you hit this, all of a sudden, you've got all the different sites with their risk score. And then all of a sudden, you've got the people with the highest risk, you're giving them, how do I get down the table so I'm not at the top of the table, the riskiest site? And these sorts of things, human nature is an amazing thing. And you can really drive some interesting activity just by presenting data in certain ways and stack ranking the sites based on their cyber maturity. So that's really all I had for the demo. I mean, it's a huge rabbit hole to go down to sort of understand the different lenses where you can cross-reference and pivot on different kinds of data. But it gives you a good idea of what's possible. And once you've got it lit up and understand the risks and exposures in your organization, being able to get comfortable, socialize that information with each, some asset stakeholders at each site, to then build a really positive working relationship to measure the risk, reduce the risk, and then measure that risk reduction and share that as a good news story back to the organization. Now, so that really is the demo. So as a conclusion, just focusing on CVEs is not an efficient way to reduce risk. You need to focus on overall risk, including device criticality, which you're probably only going to get from having a good working relationship with those stakeholders, to get those remediations to a manageable number to focus on initially. You want to look at overall exposure, not just vulnerabilities. That's, CVSS is a very limited lens on the information, and even just vulnerability, even adjusted vulnerability score, it's only one lens to look at overall risk. And our job is to reduce overall risk, not to count how many CVEs we patched in the last 3 months, right? And then finally, you build that OT remediation playbook with those asset owners, co-create it with them. You're going to get a better outcome, more engagement, and it's going to be much more effective way to reduce risk for your organization. And what is your organization's core business, which is your OT network. So with that, if you want to learn a bit more, hit me up, Leon at netseg.io. It's my phone number there. Have a great day and look forward to talking to you in the next video.